My name is Molly Parker, and I was 32 years old when I finally understood that in my family, being unwanted was never treated like a tragedy. It was treated like a scheduling decision. 3 nights before Thanksgiving, I was sitting at my kitchen counter in Chicago with my train confirmation open on my laptop and a half-finished grocery list beside me, thinking about the long weekend ahead, when my phone lit up with a text from my mother. I expected something small, maybe a reminder to bring wine or not to forget dessert. Instead, I read the kind of message that changes the temperature in your body. She told me not to come home. She said my brother was uncomfortable seeing me, as if I were some awkward topic they could keep off the table by removing one chair. I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for a second text to explain it, soften it, turn it into a misunderstanding. It never came. So I sent back one word: understood, because there is a particular kind of humiliation in begging to be included where you were never truly welcome to begin with. I canceled my ticket, put my phone face down, and told myself I was too old to let this ruin me. But on Thanksgiving Day, I still found myself sitting alone in a crowded restaurant by the lake, surrounded by families passing plates, telling old stories, arguing over nothing the way people only do when they know they belong to each other. I was trying very hard not to cry when the people at the next table noticed me, and what happened after that dinner would end with something my mother never saw coming. 5 years later, at my wedding, the family who made room for me that night would not be sitting there as guests. They would be introduced as my legal family. If you have ever learned the hard way that blood does not always mean loyalty, stay with me, because this story only gets worse before it gets better. I wish I could tell you that text blindsided me because it was so out of character, but the truth is, it only shocked me in the way a slap still shocks you, even after years of being told to expect it. My brother Dylan had been the center of gravity in our house for as long as I could remember. When he wanted attention, the room shifted. When he was upset, everybody adjusted. When he failed, it became a family emergency. When I succeeded, it was treated like pleasant background noise, something to acknowledge quickly before getting back to whatever was happening with him. By the time I was old enough to notice the pattern, it had already become the language of our family. Dylan was not just the favorite, he was the person everyone else was expected to orbit. I learned that when I was 16 and my mother canceled my birthday dinner because Dylan's team had made the regional basketball playoffs that same night. She said we would celebrate later, but later turned into next week. And next week turned into a grocery store cake set on the counter after dinner, while Dylan talked over me about a game he had won. I learned it again in college when I invited my parents to my senior art showcase, the one event I had worked toward for months, and my mother called an hour before to say they could not make it because Dylan had a campus visit with a recruiter, and he was nervous. She said, "You understand, don't you?" As if understanding were the rent I had to pay to remain in the family. Even when I got my first real design job in Chicago, my father's reaction was a distracted congratulations before asking if I had heard from Dylan, because he was between jobs again and feeling down. Everything in that house translated back to him somehow. My happiness was expected to be quiet. His discomfort became policy. The worst part was not even Dylan. Not really. It was my father, Bruce, standing by with that tired look he always wore when conflict threatened to enter the room, acting as if neutrality made him innocent. He never shouted at me. He never openly called me difficult. That would have been easier to fight. Instead, he specialized in soft betrayals. "Don't make this bigger than it is. Let your mother handle it. You know how your brother gets." He said those things like a man trying to keep the peace, but peace in our house always seemed to mean I was the one expected to swallow whatever hurt was being handed to me and call it maturity. After my mother texted me not to come home, I did something I had done too many times before. I called him anyway. Part of me still wanted him to say this had gone too far, that he had no idea she had sent that message, that of course I was coming home for Thanksgiving. Instead, he was quiet for a second too long, and that silence told me almost everything before he spoke. Then he said, "Maybe it would be better to give everyone some space this year." Space. That was the word he chose, as if I were the problem crowding the room instead of the daughter who had just been removed from it. I remember gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. I asked him if he hurt himself. I asked him if he really thought it was normal for a mother to uninvite her own daughter from Thanksgiving because her grown son felt uncomfortable. He exhaled like I was exhausting him and said he did not want to fight. That was when something in me went still. Not dramatic, not broken, just still. Because in that moment I finally understood what I had spent years refusing to name. I was not being misunderstood by my family. I was being managed by them. Reduced. Rescheduled. Kept at a distance whenever my presence threatened the version of the family they preferred to live in. I hung up without saying goodbye. A little while later, I made the mistake of opening social media, and there it was. My mother already posting one of her sentimental holiday messages about gratitude and family traditions, complete with a picture of the dining room table half set for the next day. I stared at the screen and counted the place settings without meaning to. There was a seat for my father, a seat for Dylan, a seat for my mother, a couple of extra chairs for whatever relatives might stop by. There was room for pie plates and serving bowls and centerpieces and folded cloth napkins. There just was not room for me. That was the part that settled into my chest and stayed there. They had not excluded me in the heat of an argument. They had planned around my absence. By the time Thanksgiving afternoon arrived, I knew staying home would only make me feel smaller, like I was helping them complete the picture of my own erasure. So I got dressed, fixed my makeup, and took myself out to dinner because I refused to spend the whole day proving them right about how easy it was to leave me alone. I told myself it was just a meal, just a few hours, just a holiday that would pass like any other. But when I sat down at that restaurant and heard laughter rising from every direction, when I saw grandparents passing dishes to children and couples leaning toward each other across crowded tables, I felt the full weight of what my family had done. They had not just canceled a trip. They had reminded me once again that in the world I came from, my place could always be taken back. And I still had no idea that before that dinner was over, someone at the next table was about to see straight through the smile I was forcing and offer me something I had almost stopped believing I would ever have. The woman who noticed me did not do it in a dramatic way. She did not gasp or lean across the room or make me feel exposed. She simply caught my eye at exactly the moment I was blinking too hard and pretending I was fine, then gave me the kind of look only certain older women know how to give, the kind that says, "I see what is happening, and I am not going to embarrass you by naming it out loud." She was sitting at the large round table beside mine with what was obviously her family, and a few seconds later she stood up, walked over with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions for other people, and asked the waitress to bring one more chair to their table. Then she turned to me and said, "Honey, nobody should have to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone if they do not want to." The invitation was so simple that for a second I did not know what to do with it. I started to refuse automatically, the way people like me always do when kindness arrives unexpectedly. I told her I was fine. I said I did not want to interrupt their family dinner. She smiled as if she had heard both excuses 100 times before and said, "You would only be interrupting if we did not want you there. We do. Come sit down before my husband eats the last of the stuffing." That was the first time I laughed that day, and the sound of it startled me. At their table, I met Helen Bradford, the woman who had invited me over, and her husband George, who had the kindest eyes I had seen in a long time, and immediately began sliding dishes in my direction, like feeding me was the most natural thing in the world. Their daughter Laura was there with her husband Kevin, along with two children who looked at me with bright, open curiosity instead of suspicion. And then there was Ethan, Helen, and George's grandson, who moved his glass out of the way so the waitress could squeeze in my chair and said, "Looks like you got promoted to the better table." I should not have smiled as much as I did at that, but I did. Nobody at their table came at me with invasive questions or that hungry pity some people mistake for compassion. They just made room. They asked if I wanted turkey or ham. They passed me mashed potatoes before I had to reach. Laura's little girl asked me if pumpkin pie was my favorite and seemed deeply relieved when I said yes, as if that meant I was trustworthy. The normalness of it nearly undid me more than the loneliness had. I was so used to affection in my family being conditional, rationed out according to mood and hierarchy, that I almost did not know how to sit inside simple warmth without bracing for the price of it. At some point, Helen asked, very gently, whether I had family in the area. There was no sharpness in it, no gossip in her tone, just an opening if I wanted one. I could have lied. I could have said they were out of town or that I had chosen to spend the holiday quietly. But something about that table made lying feel unnecessary. So I told the truth, at least the cleanest version of it. I told her my mother had asked me not to come home because my brother was not comfortable seeing me. I said it lightly, or tried to, like it was an awkward family complication instead of a wound that still felt fresh. The whole table went quiet for half a beat. Not in the heavy way people do when they want details, but in that stunned, decent silence people have when they know something cruel has just been described too casually. George was the first to speak. He looked genuinely confused and said, "I cannot imagine telling my child not to come home for Thanksgiving." Helen gave him a small glance that said not now, and then she looked back at me and said, "The person calling you difficult is often the person most committed to controlling the room." The sentence landed somewhere deep in me because it named a truth I had lived with for years, without ever hearing it spoken so cleanly. Ethan, sensing that I was right on the edge of crying again, leaned back in his chair and said that in his professional opinion, anyone who turned away free holiday pie had terrible judgment and questionable morals. I asked what made him qualified to issue professional opinions on pie, and he said surviving this family for 30 years. Laura told me not to encourage him. Kevin said it was too late for that. The children started arguing about whipped cream, and somehow the table tipped back into laughter without making me feel as though my sadness had been brushed aside. That was what struck me most. They made room for both things, for the hurt and for the meal. For the fact that I was a stranger and for the possibility that I did not need to feel like one for the rest of the evening. By the time dessert came, I had told them a little more. Not every ugly detail, not the whole long history of Dylan being protected at my expense, but enough for them to understand that the text from my mother had not come out of nowhere. Helen listened the way some people pray, with complete focus and no intention of interrupting. George kept topping off everyone's drinks. Ethan made quiet, dry comments at exactly the right moments, never pushing, never trying too hard, just steady enough that I found myself relaxing around him without deciding to. When dinner ended, I thanked them more times than was probably necessary. I meant to leave with nothing more than a full stomach and a story I would remember on the holidays I dreaded afterward. Instead, as we were all putting on coats, Helen touched my arm and said they hosted Sunday dinner most weeks at their house in Evanston. Nothing formal, just family and too much food. And if I ever felt like coming by, there would be a seat for me. I stood there for a second, my purse in one hand and a to-go container George had insisted I take in the other, and I realized no one had offered me a seat in a very long time without making me feel like I had to earn it. I told her I did not want to impose. She gave me a look that reminded me instantly who at that table had once spent a career telling people exactly where they stood. Then, "Do not impose," she said. "Just come hungry." I walked out into the cold Chicago night with leftovers in my bag and their phone number saved in my phone, still hearing the warmth of that table behind me. I had gone into that restaurant determined not to let one ugly message ruin me. I left with something much more dangerous than pride. I left with the first fragile feeling that maybe the family I had spent my whole life begging not to lose was not the only family I would ever have. I did not go to their Sunday dinner that same week. I told myself it was because I did not want to be presumptuous, but the truth was that I did not trust kindness that arrived without a price. In my experience, warmth was usually a loan, not a gift. It came with invisible terms, and sooner or later, someone always collected. So I thanked Helen by text and assumed that would be the end of it. Instead, she replied the way only Helen Bradford could. "Sunday at 5. George is making pot roast, and he always cooks for twice as many people as necessary." I nearly said no again, but by Sunday afternoon I was more tired of my own fear than I was of the idea of walking into their house. Their home in Evanston was warm and lived in, the kind of place that looked like people had been gathering there for years. The second Helen opened the door, all my rehearsed politeness started to fall apart. George called from the kitchen to ask if I drank red wine. Laura was setting the table. Kevin was trying to help, and mostly failing. The kids ran past me at full speed, and Ethan came in through the back carrying firewood and said there was still time to escape if I could make it look athletic. I laughed before I could stop myself, and that was the beginning. I started coming every other Sunday, then almost every Sunday without really deciding to. Nobody made a big speech about it. They just began treating my presence as normal, and there is something healing about being folded into ordinary routines instead of dramatic gestures. George would ask me to taste the gravy. Helen would hand me a dish towel and tell me to stop standing around looking decorative. Laura started texting me for design advice because she said I had better taste than Kevin, which offended him in a way he seemed to enjoy. The children began calling me whenever they needed help with school projects. Even the smallest things stayed with me. George remembered how I liked my food seasoned. Helen started saving me the corner piece of cornbread because she noticed I always reached for it last. No one acted like my place there was temporary. Ethan and I moved slowly, which was probably why it mattered. He never flirted in that polished, intrusive way some men do when they sense someone is vulnerable. He did not treat me like a project. He just kept showing up as himself. If I arrived early, he was already there helping George with groceries or making some dry comment from across the kitchen. If I stayed late, he was usually the one carrying leftovers to my car or walking me out so I would not have to cross the dark driveway alone. Our conversation started in scraps, a joke over dessert, a text about a movie, a photo from the grocery store, but they gradually lengthened into something steadier. Around the same time, my own life started shifting. The apartment I had been renting in Chicago was in a building that got sold, and with the rent going up and work turning unstable, I knew I could not stay. I did not tell many people how stressed I was, but Helen saw it anyway. One Sunday after dinner, she asked if I had found a new place yet. I told her not yet. She said the apartment over the garage was empty. They used it for guests sometimes, but mostly it sat there. If I needed somewhere stable for a while, I could stay there and pay something modest until I got my footing back. My first instinct was to refuse. Pride, habit, fear, all of it rose at once. But George sat down, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Pay rent if it makes you feel better. But do not confuse dignity with refusing help from people who care whether you land on your feet." That line stayed with me because it exposed how much of my life had been shaped by trying not to need anyone. In my family, need had always been dangerous. Here, it was treated like something ordinary. I moved into the apartment over the garage 3 weeks later. It was small but bright, with slanted ceilings and 2 deep windows, And from the first night, it felt less like somewhere I had ended up, and more like somewhere I was allowed to begin again. Laura brought towels and a coffee maker. George fixed a cabinet door before I had even finished unpacking. Helen showed up with soup, a spare key, and instructions about where the good flashlights were kept. Ethan carried the heavier boxes upstairs and, looking around at the half-unpacked room, said it already looked better with me in it. He said it casually, but I thought about it for days. Living on their property changed everything. Not because it erased the hurt of where I came from, but because it gave me daily proof that another kind of family existed. I would leave for work and find George scraping ice off both our windshields. I would come home and see light in the kitchen, knowing that if I walked across the yard, there would be people glad to see me. Ethan and I still had not named whatever was happening between us, but by then it had become impossible to ignore. He knew how I took my coffee, when I was tired before I admitted it, and when to joke instead of trying to fix me. One snowy night, we ended up on the back steps eating reheated pizza while the yard turned white in the porch light. I apologized for something small that had not even been my fault, and he turned to me and said, "You apologize like someone is always waiting to tell you that you took up too much room." I did not answer because I could not. He did not push. He just sat there beside me until I finally said, "Maybe they were." By the end of that first year, I was no longer just the woman Helen had invited over out of kindness on Thanksgiving. I was the person George called over to taste the sauce, the person the children expected at birthdays, the person Laura texted for help, the person Ethan looked for when he walked into a room. And for the first time in my life, belonging did not feel like something I had to earn. It felt like something being freely given. By the second year, the strangest part was not that I had become close to the Bradfords. It was how natural it felt, as if some missing piece in my life had finally slid into place. I still worked in the city, still paid my own bills, still kept my own routines. But somewhere along the way, the apartment over the garage stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like home. Not just because it was safe and warm, but because there were people on the other side of the yard who noticed when I had a long day, saved me a plate without making a show of it, and spoke about my future as if it mattered. Being around them forced me to face something ugly. In my family, what I had called maturity was really just endurance. I had been praised for being easy because it made me easier to ignore. I had been called understanding whenever I absorbed disappointments that should have embarrassed other people. The Bradfords never said that directly, but with them, the truth became impossible to miss. Ethan and I stopped pretending there was nothing between us in early spring. It happened after one of the kids' birthday dinners, when I stayed behind to help with dishes and he stayed too. I made some half-joking comment about spending most of my life feeling like an extra in other people's celebrations. He looked at me and said, "You are not an extra here, Molly. You have not been for a long time." Then he kissed me, and it did not feel sudden. It felt like something honest finally being said out loud. We moved slowly after that, but never uncertainly. He never treated me like someone fragile or broken. He was simply steady, patient, and kind in a way that made me trust him more every week. Around him, I stopped apologizing for every bad day. I stopped shrinking before anyone asked me to. One summer afternoon, I was helping Helen in the kitchen when a friend of hers stopped by and casually called me her daughter. Helen did not correct her. After the woman left, I joked about being promoted in the family, but Helen looked at me and said softly, "It would not be an accident." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Wanting to belong had always felt dangerous in my old life, but this was different. I was not forcing my way into a closed room. I was being invited in by people who had already been acting like family for a long time. Then my mother reminded me exactly why that mattered. Every few months she sent one of those cold little messages that were never really about me, only about keeping some thread attached. Then one afternoon, she left a voicemail saying she had heard I was spending all my time with another family and that people were starting to ask questions. She even laughed and said she hoped I was not doing anything dramatic. I sat in my car listening to that message and understood something clearly. She was not afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing the right to explain me. When I played the message for Helen and George, George said, "It sounds like she is less worried about you than she is about witnesses." A few days later, Helen asked me to take a walk with her. We sat near the lake, and she told me plainly that what my family had done was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Then she said that if I ever wanted to make official what had already become true, she and George would be honored to do that. She did not pressure me. She just offered it with complete certainty and let me decide. I cried because some part of me had wanted exactly that for longer than I had admitted. The legal adoption process was not dramatic. It was forms, signatures, and serious conversations, but every step mattered to me. For the first time in my life, saying yes did not feel like surrender. It felt like choosing myself. Ethan drove me to the hearing because I was too nervous to drive, and when it was over, I walked back out into the cold air, no longer only Molly Parker. I was Molly Bradford too. The name did not erase my past. It marked where I had been chosen. Helen cried in the car. George pretended he had something in his eye, and that night the whole family came over with cake, champagne, and a crooked handmade banner from the kids. A few months later, Ethan took me back to the restaurant by the lake where his grandmother had first pulled an extra chair up to their table. After dinner, he asked me to marry him. There was nothing flashy about it. Just Ethan asking the most important question of my life with that same quiet steadiness he had always had. I said yes before he had even fully finished. When we told Helen and George, Helen cried again. George hugged Ethan hard enough to make him complain, and Laura immediately started talking about wedding plans. For a little while, it all felt peaceful. Then the invitations went out, and under the wedding details were the words that finally made public what had once only been private truth. Parents of the bride, Helen and George Bradford. I knew what those words meant to me. I just did not realize yet what they were about to mean to the people who had always assumed I would remain theirs to dismiss. For a little while after the invitations went out, nothing happened. No angry calls, no dramatic emails, no relatives suddenly remembering I existed. The silence almost fooled me into thinking my family had finally decided to leave me alone. Then, about 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother called 3 times in one afternoon. I let every call go to voicemail. When I listened later, her voice had that same strained calm she always used when she wanted to sound wounded and reasonable. She said she had seen the invitation, said she did not understand what kind of stunt I thought I was pulling, and said I needed to call her back before I embarrassed the family any further. Not once did she ask if I was happy. The panic in her voice was not about losing me. It was about being replaced in public. A few days later, Dylan texted me, "Mom is a mess. You need to stop this. You have made your point." I did not answer either of them. The wedding weekend arrived in Galena at a small vineyard venue with rolling hills and warm lights. It was beautiful without being showy. Exactly what I wanted. I did not want a giant spectacle. I wanted one day that belonged entirely to the life I had chosen. On the morning of the ceremony, the bridal suite was full of the kind of noise that somehow calms you when it comes from people who love you. Laura was trying to manage the flower girl. Kevin was being sent on errands. George kept pretending he was not emotional. And Helen stood behind me, fastening the buttons on my dress. She caught my eye in the mirror and said, "You look exactly like someone who knows where she belongs." I nearly cried right there. Right before the ceremony, Ethan sent me one text. "No matter what happens today, I am already proud of the life you built." I read it 4 times. Then George came to get me, offered me his arm, And for one perfect second, I stopped being nervous. Because whatever happened next, the important part was already true. I had already been chosen. The ceremony had just begun when I saw them. My mother and Dylan were standing near the back, not invited, but still carrying themselves like they expected their presence to matter more than my peace. For a split second, my stomach dropped. Then George's arm tightened slightly beneath my hand, and he kept walking me forward like a man escorting his daughter to her wedding, which is exactly what he was doing. That was the first moment their power failed. When the officiant spoke my full name, Molly Bradford, I saw my mother's face change. Then George placed my hand in Ethan's, and when the officiant asked, "Who gives this bride in love and blessing today?" George answered, "Her mother and I do." I heard the small, sharp sound my mother made in the back, but the ceremony continued. We said our vows. We kissed. We were married. Whatever scene might come next, they had already failed. The real confrontation came at the reception. Laura quietly told me my mother and brother wanted a private word. Of course they did. People like that always want privacy after making sure they have been noticed. I walked toward the patio with Ethan on one side of me and George on the other. My mother looked straight at me and said, "Have you lost your mind?" Dylan added, "This has gone far enough. You made your point." My mother demanded to know if I understood how humiliating this was. I said, "No, they are talking about me. This is my wedding." Dylan said I was acting like a victim over something that happened years ago. I simply said, "You had 5 years to speak to me privately. You chose silence until the consequences became public." Before my mother could answer, George stepped forward and said, "We did not take anything from you. You taught her that love was conditional. We taught her it was not." Dylan took a step toward me, and Ethan moved between us at once. My mother said with fury, "She is my daughter." From behind me, Helen answered, "A daughter is not a title you keep after treating her like an inconvenience." I looked at my mother and said, "You stopped being my safe place a long time ago. That is what you lost." "Not tonight. Years ago." Venue staff were already approaching. George nodded once, and that was enough. Dylan muttered that the whole family would hear about this. I looked at him and said, "They should." Then the two of them were escorted out, and the most satisfying part was not watching them leave. It was realizing that once they were gone, the night did not collapse. The band started again. Helen smoothed a hand over my hair. Ethan took my hand and led me back to the dance floor. Just like that, the center of the story returned to where it belonged. Not to my mother's outrage, not to Dylan's entitlement, to the life I had built anyway. A year later, Thanksgiving was at our house. Not a borrowed table, not a restaurant, not some place where I was waiting to see whether there would be room for me. Our house. Ethan was in the kitchen arguing with George about whether the turkey needed another 15 minutes. Helen was pretending not to supervise while quietly supervising everything. Laura had brought 2 pies, even though she knew Helen had already made 3. Kevin was opening wine. The kids were running through the hallway with the kind of energy only children and people who feel safe ever seem to have. I stood in the middle of all that noise with a serving spoon in my hand and realized something so simple it almost made me laugh. For the first time in my life, I was not bracing myself through a holiday. I was living inside one. That was the part no one in my old family would ever fully understand. They would probably tell the story differently for the rest of their lives. My mother would say I abandoned them. Dylan would say I turned one disagreement into a permanent grudge. Maybe my father would say he wished things had gone another way. But the truth was much less dramatic and much more final than any version they would tell. I had simply stopped returning to the place where love was always treated like something I had to earn by making myself smaller. A few months after the wedding, my father sent me a letter. Not a text. Not a voicemail passed through my mother's anger. A real letter, written by hand. In it, He admitted what he had never been willing to say out loud when it mattered. He wrote that he had known for years that things were unfair. He wrote that keeping the peace had become an excuse for cowardice. He wrote that every time he stayed quiet to make life easier for my mother and my brother, he had made life harder for me. I believe that he meant it. I even cried when I read it. But belief and reconciliation are not the same thing. I wrote back one short note. I told him I was sorry it had taken losing me for him to tell the truth. But I had already built a life that no longer depended on whether my old family finally understood what they had done. As for my mother and Dylan, I heard enough through distant relatives to know that the wedding had not gone the way they expected. My mother had tried to tell people she had been humiliated, but too many people already knew the beginning of the story. Once the Thanksgiving text came to light, sympathy dried up fast. Dylan was still angry, still convinced I had somehow wronged him by refusing to revolve around his comfort anymore. But that anger no longer had anywhere to land. I had blocked the numbers, closed the door, and stopped confusing access with love. That evening, just before dinner, Helen tapped her glass and told everyone to sit down. The room settled. Candlelight flickered across the table. Plates clinked softly. I looked around and saw George smiling at me from the end of the table, Ethan reaching for my hand under the tablecloth, Laura passing rolls to the kids, Helen watching all of us with that calm, satisfied expression she wore when the people she loved were exactly where they were supposed to be. And when everyone asked me to say grace, I did. I said that for a long time I thought family was something you were born into and obligated to keep, no matter how badly it hurt. But I had learned that real family is not defined by blood alone. Real family is made of the people who make room for you at the table, who speak your name with love, who do not ask you to disappear so someone else can stay comfortable. I said that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop begging to be chosen by people who are committed to overlooking them. Sometimes the bravest thing is to build a new table instead. When I finished, nobody rushed to fill the silence. They just looked at me with the kind of understanding that makes words unnecessary. Then Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. George lifted his glass. Ethan smiled at me like he already knew every part of my heart that had once been broken and loved me anyway. And in that moment, I understood the lesson my old life had taken years to teach me. Blood can make you related. It cannot make you safe. History can explain pain. It does not excuse it. And love, real love, does not ask you to shrink in order to receive it. So if you are the person in your family who is always told to be the bigger person, to stay quiet, to keep the peace, remember this. Peace built on your silence is not peace. It is surrender. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to walk away from people who only notice your value when they lose access to you. And you are absolutely allowed to build a life where your seat at the table is never in question. That Thanksgiving, when we finally bowed our heads and passed the food around, I was not thinking about the house I had not been welcome in 5 years earlier. I was thinking about the extra chair a stranger pulled up for me in a crowded restaurant, and how one small act of kindness had changed the direction of my entire life. I thought I was being rejected. What was really happening was that I was being led somewhere better. And if this story means anything at all, it is this. The right people will never make you beg for the love they are already willing to give. At Revenge Argonne, our team is working hard to create stories that are engaging, meaningful, and emotionally powerful. This story is entirely fictional and is shared for entertainment purposes, while also aiming to offer educational lessons, valuable knowledge, and thoughtful life perspectives for our viewers. Molly handled the situation with remarkable strength, dignity, and self-respect. Instead of begging for acceptance from people who kept hurting her, she chose boundaries, healing, and a better life. If you were in her place, Would you have walked away and built a new life too? Or would you have given your family one more chance?